Good evening, good morrow, and good day. It's Jack here with a brand new feature here on the Slice and Dice channel. This I call Don't Believe the Hype. Basically, what I'm going to be doing with this feature is I'm periodically going to be releasing videos discussing classes, races, and other features from Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, which are, I think, criminally overlooked or underestimated, or else are given a lot of flack by the community as a whole. So for this very first feature of Don't Believe the Hype, I'm going to talk all about a class that's very close to my heart, and that is the Ranger. To kind of break down for you some of the misconceptions, we'll go through level by level, and I'll just go through each and every feature and discuss kind of my thoughts on it and what it means. So without any further ado, let's talk all about the Ranger. Dungeons and motherfucking Dragons! First of all, you get a D10 hit dice, which keeps you in line with all of the martial kind of classes. The fighters and the paladins also get a D10, and the barbarian is the only one that exceeds that with a D12. So you're already up there in terms of hit points. You also get proficiencies in strength and dexterity saving throws, which means you're basically combat adept and ready for a lot of fights. Dexterity saving throws, very, very useful for a ranger. Dexterity in general is going to be useful, and unless you're going for a melee build, strength is going to be useful. So the fact that both are covered in saving throws is great. It's also identical to the saving throws the monk gets. Just a little bit of trivia there. You get proficiencies in light armor, medium armor, shields, and martial and simple weapons. So all weapons apart from improvised weapons. Which also emphasises kind of the martial training that you've received as a wilderness wanderer. Also gives you some reasons to put some of your numbers into dexterity, because even if you're going for a melee build of ranger, and that is one of the things I appreciate with the ranger, that you can go either way. You can do a strength build ranger and do a more melee build, and you can do a dexterity build and go for more range if that's what you prefer, or you can go for a melee build that uses dexterity. But it's going to pay dividends to put some of your stats into dexterity because of the improved armor class. Even if you're going to go for a melee build, you're probably going to be wearing medium armor, in which case, and so you'll get up to a +2 dependent on your dex modifier. So if you have a dex of 14, that gives you a +2 in dex. That gives you a +2 bonus to your medium armor class. So it's definitely worth doing, even if you're going for a strength build, to put some points into dexterity. You also get 3 skills to choose from. There's a range of, obviously, ranger-based skills to choose from. Range, that's going to happen a lot, I apologise. But they're all very flavourful ones to choose from. And 3 skills, notably, is going to be 1 more than the fighters and the paladins get. And it's 1 behind the rogue, meaning you can be more versatile, really. And I think versatility is one of the ranger's strengths. That I think people often miss, that it has something to offer in most situations, rather than being an expert in one particular field as a rogue would be, or a paladin perhaps would be. The ranger offers versatility and offers a bit of something in every situation. But with the 3 skills that you get to choose between, this also helps kind of flavour your character, but also kind of gives some, if you're going into the mechanical grind, gives you some kind of basis of which way you want to take your ranger in. For instance, there are some skills more wisdom based that maybe lean you more towards the kind of druidic spellcasting side of the ranger, and perhaps there you might want to take the more rogue-like abilities, stealth and so on, just to kind of give you that subterfuge edge. And of course there's some for fighters as well. I think athletics comes up, I'll have to double check that. But certainly there are skills there just to kind of help fit a classic ranger no matter what you choose, but give you leanings towards the different flavours of the ranger. Now these level 1 features are claimed by many to be absolutely terrible, and that they are not useful at all compared to some of the other classes' first level abilities. Now, I think that there's a common misconception with this, and I think that there are many ways to make this a really good feature, but it does require one thing which some players may not be willing to do, and that is, as follows. First of all, collaboration and communication. Ideally, if you're playing a ranger, when you go in at level 1, you really need to have some idea of the campaign you're going to be playing in or participating in before the game starts. The ranger's meant to be an expert in the wilderness, so it makes no sense if you're dropped kind of into a game without any further knowledge, unless that befits the setting. If you are literally taken from your home world and put somewhere else, maybe then that would realistically mean you're going to have less knowledge and therefore be less adept and able to offer your skills in an environment you're not used to. I've found through my experience that favoured terrain and favoured enemy actually makes the ranger really mechanically useful for exploration and tracking, provided that your favoured terrain or your favoured enemy actually features in the campaign at all. If you don't communicate with your DM, you're obviously going to have no idea what is going to be appearing in your campaign. So I think it's really important to just kind of... The DM doesn't have to tell you everything that's going on, of course not. The DM's going to have their secrets and things that they want you to uncover as you go along. But to give you a grounding to start with, it makes sense just to ask sort of what territory we would be exploring initially, or we'd be found in, or that may feature in the campaign. They don't have to tell you when. They could just perhaps give you hints, or even just say outright, give you a sort of a map of the land, and just let you kind of work from there. You'll be starting in this area, for instance, and then you can just work from that, what kind of territory you think would work as your favoured terrain. But also, if you are really stuck, then favoured enemy. There are some legitimate choices in the player's handbook. I would remember that not only can you make a choice of one group of enemies, for instance, dragons, celestials, fae, undead. Some of those are going to feature quite a lot, especially at low levels. Undead would be a pretty solid choice, unless there is no undead in your campaign. But you're never going to go wrong with 2 humanoid races, because the other option in the player's handbook is that you can choose 2 humanoid options. Maybe I thought about choosing humans as one of your favoured enemies, because a lot of the NPCs you're going to interact with will be humans. And especially if you're going for a kind of a bounty hunter vibe, something like that, then the humans as a favoured enemy, really, really solid. I'm playing in a game currently where I've got a bounty hunter character who is a ranger, and humans are one of their favoured enemies, and it has proved useful already. So just saying, think about that. So as I said earlier, exploration, a massive part of Natural Explorer and favoured enemy. One of the things I think people miss in the criticism of the Player's Handbook Ranger is the fact that exploration was in the conception of 5th edition. The Wizards of the Coast thought that exploration was going to be a much more fundamental part of the game and would be featured a lot more heavily than it actually is in a lot of groups. So as a DM, if you know that somebody in your party is going to be playing a ranger, include exploration in there and emphasize the fact that exploration is made easier by the ranger being in your party. For instance, travelling between one destination and another. If you have a ranger in the party, I think it's worth emphasising sort of the resource management side of things, water, food. And the fact that you've got a ranger there means that they're going to forage twice as much food in their favoured terrain. They're going to be naturally good at foraging anyway, and tracking and so on. And just, really taking that time to really let the ranger shine, because, exploration really is their area. That is the bit they excel in. And the reason why I've seen rangers in some groups really kind of feel their abilities have been squandered and not being used at all is because that very feature, exploration, is missing from the campaign. So if you've got a ranger in your gaming group and you're DMing it, make sure that you emphasize the exploration and you let your ranger player just have their moment, just to make them feel special, because wilderness is the ranger's jam. So just let them have those moments. As I said, highlight them, especially for new players, for those around the table who haven't played before. Even if they're not playing the ranger character, it highlights that the entire table are aware that these things are being made easier by the ranger being there, or the ranger is getting a sense of things that the other characters may not be able to grasp. For instance, you see several sets of tracks in the sand. The ranger will have advantage on this check, seeing as the footprints resemble one of their favoured enemies. And their proficiency bonus is also doubled due to being in their favoured terrain, desert. The ranger learns that this is a passing pack of 8 gnolls and passed through here just 2 hours ago. The fact that they get wins, that it's one of their favoured enemies, especially at higher levels, they're going to have quite a few favoured enemies, gives them that moment to feel special. They get to roll 2 dice instead of 1. As a player, whenever you get to roll with advantage and rolling 2d20s instead of 1, you automatically feel a little bit special, and especially for a ranger, you're going to feel a little bit more of an expert. The fact that you can that you get advantage on this roll because these are creatures you're familiar with really plays into that flavour of the ranger. Just to summarise then, with Natural Explorer and Favoured Enemy, collaboration and communication, exploration, emphasise exploration, and highlight these features to the table. With those 3 in mind, Natural Explorer and Favoured Enemy not only is a flavourful ribbon, but also contributes more to perhaps even the plot of your campaign. Fighting style, as the name suggests, makes your ranger a bit more martial, a bit more fightery. If you're looking to be more of a ranged combat participant, then archery fighting style definitely makes the most sense to you, as it gives you a +2 to your attack rolls, meaning you're much less likely to miss with those bows. If you prefer sword and board, you can take the dueling fighting style, which will make your melee attacks more deadly, adds a +2 to your damage roll. Notably, people miss with dueling that you can still have a shield equipped in one hand and use a melee weapon in the other. It specifies in dueling you can only have one melee weapon in your hand and no weapon in the other. A shield does not count as a weapon, therefore with dueling you can still have a shield and still duel to your heart's content. So if you also a kind of ranger who wants to kind of do a Legolas and juggle 2 weapons at once, the 2-weapon fighting style means that you're essentially ambidextrous. It means you can add your proficiency bonus to your offhand attack. If you don't have the 2-weapon fighting style, and you can still make 2 attacks, however, you don't get to add your proficiency bonus with your offhand attack. And then finally, if you want to kind of be a bit more versatile and open to, maybe, for instance, you like to use 2 swords, but you also like to use the bow as well when the mood strikes or when the situation allows. If you're really not sure, or you're just looking to bolster your defences a little bit, then the defence fighting style, although perhaps the least exciting of the choices, gives you a reliable +1 to your armour class, making you that much tougher, which is always handy. I think spellcasting is actually one of the ranger's strengths, but I see a lot of criticism online about rangers spellcasting. Usually the 2 things that I've seen the most have been 1, they don't get enough spells, and 2, they can only change spells when they level. So to address those points then, on the first point, as a point of comparison, at 20th level a ranger can know a maximum of 11 spells. It's not a lot. Whereas a 20th level paladin with a 20 charisma, only if they have a 20 charisma, can prepare 15 spells, which can be changed at a long rest. This is often used when criticising the ranger because the paladin can choose from any of their source of spells and prepare a list of spells from their entire list. As the cleric does, kind of getting their spells from their divine entity, whereas the ranger has to change up their spells as they level. I think it misses one vital point, that comparison though. Spell slots. Not only does the paladin and the ranger have exactly the same number of spell slots, because they are the only 2 half-casters until the artificer was introduced, but also the paladin has another ability that uses up spell slots very quickly. It's a feature which a paladin player will be inclined to use quite a lot, and that is the Divine Smite. Now, I'm not knocking the Divine Smite. As a paladin ability, it's fantastic. It's a great combat enhancement for them, as it adds a minimum of 2d8 extra damage to a melee attack, which they can add on after the attack hits, so they don't need to declare it beforehand and have the risk of missing. But that also, whilst being a great feature, sacrifices a spell slot each time it's used. And both the ranger and the paladin can only regain their spell slots on a long rest. So I think the difference in the number of spells is kind of negated by that they don't get enough spells. Is kind of negated by that fact. Also, in terms of the number of spells they can choose from, although the paladin can choose from any of their spells and the ranger can't, the actual number of spells they have to choose from is very similar. There's only a difference of about 3 or 4 between paladin spells and ranger spells available in the PHB, at least. I haven't done the research with Xanathar's Guide. The paladin is similar to, it's kind of the half-casting version of the cleric, in that they can call down their spells from their divine entity and change them during a long rest, same as a cleric does. By comparison, the ranger can only change their spell upon leveling, which again is lobbied kind of as a criticism, because the druid, for which spell casting is the most similar to the ranger shares a lot of spells with the druid. The druid also can, during a long rest, can change their spells, whereas a ranger can't. That doesn't seem to make any sense. I would argue that the ranger, yes, can only change their spells upon leveling, but that is common for a lot of spellcasting classes. For instance, the bard, the sorcerer, and the warlock, and the subclasses, the arcane trickster rogue, and the eldritch knight fighter, only get to change their spells upon leveling. So why is this a big deal? I guess because the argument being that the ranger should be to the druid what the paladin is to the cleric. But I think that is a too simplistic a comparison, because the ranger, although it takes some of its spellcasting influence from the druid, it does not have that same relationship as a paladin and a cleric does. A ranger kind of has a mix of druid, fighter, and rogue, kind of all combined within it. Yeah, it may be a challenge that the spells can only get changed upon leveling, but that's the same challenge which other spellcasting classes have to face. Now, the argument is, of course, yes, that's true. However, rangers are half-casters and therefore don't have a lot of spells to access anyway. And yeah, I guess that is a challenge. But also, when you think about it, this suits the flavour of the ranger. The ranger is meant to be a wilderness expert. They should be specialists in their field. They may have a limited amount of magical tricks up their sleeve, but each one that they know, they should really know how to use them. The spells that they have is almost like just combat enhancements, if you like, or sort of little extra features that they have to not only make that ranger feel special and unique, but also to show what they can contribute in either an exploratory or combat situation. They don't have the divine entity to call upon them to give them strength like a paladin does, nor do they have the magical connection to nature like the druid does. I think in some ways, flavour-wise, if the ranger could access anything from their list of spells in the same way as a druid does, it takes away from that special natural connection which the druid, it's all about. The druid class is all about their connection to nature. So by the ranger having it as well, it kind of detracts almost from the druid class. Whereas the ranger isn't meant to be this kind of conduit for natural elemental energy. But they are meant to be experts in their field, and that being the wilderness. They should be more relying on their own cunning, their knowledge of terrain, and their martial prowess to kind of get them through tough situations and enhance this with a limited magical connection. And so for me, it feels correct that the ranger should only change their spells upon leveling. It's also true that a ranger player will have to think carefully about which spells they choose at each level, but as I said before, that's the same deal as many of the spellcasting classes. In addition to that, the ranger has access to some excellent spells. Some of the best spells and some of the best candidates for being robbed with the Bard's Magical Secrets, for instance, come from the ranger spells. And again, although you don't get the most amount of spell slots, being that you are a half-casting class, you still have access to some fantastic spells, which, just to note, have been borrowed by some other classes as well. The ranger-specific spells I'll talk to you about, but before that, let's touch on a couple of great little spells that the ranger gets, which some of the other classes do too. One great example would be Healing Spirit. This this spell, this second level spell, is often banned at tables because it is perceived to be completely broken. And you know what? Yeah, it is a pretty powerful healing spell if used right. It's just that powerful for healing party members that some tables ban it completely, which is a laugh. But hey, the Ranger has it. Equally, Pass Without Trace gives a +10 buff to stealth for your entire party. So this turns any party, even one that's full of armoured, clanking individuals, into a stealth party, because that's a +10 passive to your stealth. So every time you roll stealth, you can have +10 to it, and that's going to negate any kind of disadvantage from wearing heavy armour. So, as I said, on top of that, Rangers have some fantastic exclusive spells for their class. Now, you'll notice that most of these are kind of offer combat buffs and some area of effect and control abilities. Prime example, and the one that is certainly lauded above all others, is Hunter's Mark. It's such a good feature that there's been an argument, I think it was actually brought in with the Unearthed Arcana Ranger, to almost build it into the class. In fact, in Xanathar's Guide, the Monster Slayer subclass of the Ranger has been given a buff that's very similar to Hunter's Mark, just kind of demonstrating how good this spell is. So, Hunter's Mark not only offers an extra d6 damage every time one target you designate is hit, it's a bonus action to declare that creature as your target, and then each time you hit them whilst maintaining concentration, you do an extra d6 damage. The reason why it's concentration is not only for the extra damage you do, but for as long as the spell lasts and you maintain concentration, you have advantage on perception and survival checks to track down that target. So if it's the big bad and they somehow manage to make a break for it and get away into the forest, your ranger can then track them down. Other examples of great ranger spells, just a short list here. Feel free to look up the entirety of them yourself, but what I found: Conjure Barrage, a 3rd level spell which causes 3d8 damage in a 60-foot cone, great for hordes. And Swift Quiver, yes, it's a 5th level spell, it's one of their last spells they can access, but it allows them to produce an endless supply of ammunition whilst concentrating for up to 1 minute, as well as granting you 2 extra shots as a bonus action each turn, doubling your attack output. In fact, that last one is so good that I'm sure it's a strong contestant for Magical Secrets if you happen to be playing a bow-wielding bard. So in summary of the Paladin versus Ranger spellcasting, I would conclude that Paladins may have higher initial damage output from smiting and other spells, but they are prone to burning through their spells that much quicker than the Ranger, particularly if the Ranger maintains concentration on Hunter's Mark or similar throughout an encounter. It's going to make the Ranger very consistent in their damage output. Admittedly, as a 3rd level feature, this is really, well, just as a feature in general, this is really quite frustrating, since it not only uses up one of your precious spell slots, you don't have a lot of those, but it doesn't give the specificity that you would hope for. At the cost of 1 spell slot, you can sense whether aberrations, celestials, dragons, elementals, fae, fiends and undead are within 1 mile of you, or 6 miles if you're in your favoured terrain. Sounds great. However, it doesn't reveal the exact location or the number of creatures, meaning that you just get a general sense in 1 mile whether there are these creatures present. Or actually, it's somehow, if you're in your favoured terrain, it almost detracts from it, because then 6 miles means there's even more, there's even like wider field to look into. Anyway, that being said, there are niche uses for this ability, which actually may make it quite useful, such as being warned ahead of time that there are undead in the area so that your wizard can cast protection from evil and good, or if you're a Monster Slayer Ranger, you could cast it on yourself. Your cleric can save their channel divinity to use turn undead, and so your ranger can look for undead tracks with advantage if they're their favoured enemy. So it gives you some heads up as to what you may encounter going forward. It seems unlikely, though it could happen, that your DM would just throw out one of those many types of creatures that is just on the edge of your Primeval Awareness and is actually not going to be touched by your group at all. They may want to occasionally just throw you off the scent, but more than likely, if that's pinging on your Primeval Awareness, it's probably because it's something you're going to come across later on. Depends how much of a dick your DM is feeling. So yeah, forewarned is forearmed, so the Primeval Awareness does help with that. I've seen online compare Primeval Awareness to Divine Sense and think it should operate more like that. Divine Sense is a paladin ability that doesn't cost a spell slot, and it lets you sense whether celestials, fiends or undead are within 60 feet of you. But there is one vital thing that's missed with this comparison. So with Divine Sense, it specifies in the description that the creature is not behind total cover, which if it's in a different room to the paladin, it's therefore in total cover, or even if it's round a corner out of sight, it's also in total cover. And it also doesn't reveal their identities, meaning that even if you're in the same room as one of these beings, you're not going to know exactly who it is. Again, there are uses for Divine Sense, but Primeval Awareness doesn't specify on whether these creatures are hiding. It gives you a broader insight into your surroundings, though admittedly at a higher cost. Okay, so I'll skip this for higher levels, but obviously ability score improvements are always going to be welcome. You can max out those skills that are going to make your ranger that much more proficient in combat, in exploration and so on. Dexterity, wisdom, constitution, strength, who knows, whatever you want to build up, it's obviously going to make your character that much better no matter what you choose. Like most classes, the ranger gets the usual amount of ability score improvements as they level. They get 5 in total, unlike the fighter and the rogue who get more. I think the fighter gets 7 and the rogue gets 6. But then neither of their core classes have spellcasting included, so I guess that kind of balances out. But you may also want to take a feat. Feats obviously make your ranger character that much more unique, flavourful, whilst also providing some really useful skills at the expense of improving your base ability scores. Typically, the ranger's going to want to improve their ability scores to enhance their attacks, at least initially, so strength or dexterity, depending on if you're melee or ranged, or perhaps wisdom if you want to improve that spell casting. And so also some of the skills that you use, for instance, perception. If you improve your wisdom, it's always going to be useful for things like perception, for insight, animal handling, all that sort of thing. But feats will make your rangers stand out, and there are definitely some that are very appropriate for your rangers. So by all means choose whatever's most appropriate to your character, but here's a couple of suggestions. If you're wielding a bow or a crossbow or any other ranged weapon, sharpshooter will make you oh so deadly with that plus 10 damage at the expense of -5 to your attack roll. If you've already taken the archery fighting style, then that's only really going to be a -3 to your attack, so it's probably worth it. Equally, Skulker is going to make you able to fire shots from the shadows and not have to displace each time you take a shot. You can just keep shooting from the shadows to your heart's content. If you're into 2-weapon fighting, improve on that 2-weapon fighting style and try Dual Wielder. It will give you a bonus to your AC as well as additional features for your damage, and make you able to wield 2 weapons at once and pull out 2 different weapons in one move, or stow 2 weapons in one move. It's quite useful for that kind of style. Or if you're looking for a bit more battlefield control, alert and mobile are also great choices for your ranger character, particularly if you've got a high dexterity. Provided it fits with your character, as I said, no feat is a bad choice. Nice and simple, this one. Enhancing your martial leanings, you get a second attack, meaning you get 2 opportunities to shoot, stab, or otherwise manipulate your foes with grapple attacks. Yeah, that's right. If you get an extra attack, you should use grapple at some point. It could pay dividends. So, it says in the PHB, that you should each time you get a new favoured enemy or a natural explorer improvement, another favoured terrain, that you should choose something that's been influenced by your campaign so far. I think certainly is true, and also particularly if you kind of know the direction that your campaign's moving into. Hopefully through some lore drops and other hints that the DM's been leaving for you, little plot hooks and so on, you should have a fairly good idea of what may be coming up next. So pick a territory you think is going to be useful. I personally would choose something that my character has experienced already to kind of give that justification for them then having proficiency or having that favoured terrain, rather than choosing something I know is coming yet have not experienced yet as a character. But that's just the role player in me coming out. So if you're moving into a different territory or encountering a lot more bullywugs than usual, then cater to your campaign by taking extra control with your next favoured terrain and favoured enemy. Okay, so you get your second ability score improvement, but you also get this flavourful buff. Now, I've talked about ability score improvements already, so we're going to skip over that. Landstride. You're no longer hindered by non-magical difficult terrain and can pass through non-magical plants without being slowed or taking damage. Now, this really leans into the wilderness survivalist characteristics of the ranger, and it gives you that much more combat mobility, particularly in areas where there's going to be difficult terrain around. For instance, you're kind of in a trench or similar, or you're in a swamp. Then actually having this just gives you that extra mobility to move around the battlefield as you see fit. Also means that other creatures who are trying to approach you are going to get slowed by that difficult terrain, whereas you can just walk right over it. Yeah, just like Legolas does in Lord of the Rings on that mountainside in the snow, while everyone else is just pushing their way through and trying to fight off cold as best they can, and he just waltzes over the top. That'll be you. You also get advantage on saving throws against plants that are magically created or manipulated to impede movement, like the Entangle spell. Okay, so this part is quite a niche ability, but it will give you the edge when fighting druids, dryads, and other guardians of nature, which seems entirely appropriate for a ranger. You should know your way around these kind of natural spells. So yeah, it's still a useful ability when used. First, Natural Explorer, as we've touched on earlier, this adds a third environment that you can utilise your ranger abilities to, increasing your versatility. Again, just choose one. You're going to accumulate a few of these Natural Explorer improvements, so pick one that you think is going to be useful. Don't pick one because it sounds cool. That would be a mistake. But Hide in Plain Sight. Now, this ability has been given a lot of flack online, and I don't think that the flack it's given is entirely justified. If anything, I think it's misunderstanding the ability, or perhaps just not thinking through enough scenarios where this could be useful. Perhaps need to think outside the box a little bit more on this one. So on the face of it, some have argued that this is an underpowered ability because it takes a long time to do. It takes you 1 minute to prepare. It takes you 1 minute to create camouflage that gives you a +10 to your stealth, but only as long as you remain in one place without moving or taking actions. The argument that's lobbied by comparison is that a rogue at this level with expertise in stealth will already have at least +10 to their stealth checks anyway. Or you could get the same ability by casting Pass Without Trace as a second level spell. That will give you a +10 to your stealth as well. And it doesn't stop you moving or taking actions. I think there's some merit in that argument. Yes, the rogue could possibly, with expertise, have a +10 to their stealth. The rogue is entirely built around stealth, though, so that makes so much sense that they would have that. And being stealthy and skirmishing, that is the thing that they do. That is their area of expertise. The ranger is never going to be able to match the rogue in terms of stealthiness on core abilities alone. The ranger has an element of rogue there, but they are not a rogue. That's not how it works. But there are more uses for the Hide in Plain Sight ability than it might appear, and here are a couple of examples. Firstly, if you're planning an ambush, get one of your party to lure enemies your way. You could, in fact, if you're preparing an ambush, you could cast Pass Without Trace on yourself and then start preparing your camouflage. That will give you a +20 bonus to stealth. It will cost you just over a minute in time to prepare, but you'll have a +20 bonus to stealth checks for up to an hour. So if an enemy still spots you while you've got +20 to your stealth and you're hiding in plain sight, they're either ridiculously observant or your DM really doesn't want your plan to work out. But a +20 to stealth is incredible. Secondly, this is a perfect ability for rests in the wild. Now, this is the thing that I think people have completely missed with this ability. There's no time limit on how long the +10 to stealth lasts with with hide in plain sight. The only specificity is you can't move or take actions. Okay, that's a hindrance. However, keeping watch, you do not need to take an action to do a watch. You can do so without moving. You can stay in one place and just keep an eye out. Why not cover yourself in camouflage and then sleep where you're hiding? I mean, sleeping doesn't cost an action, right? So that means that even if an enemy happens upon your party during a long rest, they're not going to notice you being asleep and camouflaged on one side, meaning that you're going to get the jump on your enemies either way. You could even take a watch from your position and still avoid detection from any creatures that pass through as well. But if you're going scouting on your own, for instance, you may want to, just to make sure you're not discovered, to camouflage yourself and then lay low and keep an eye out observing on your scouting mission. You're much less likely to be spotted, and it lasts for as long as you do, as long as you don't move or take any actions. So I think bearing those two things in mind, so ambushes and resting, actually hide in plain sight could be pretty darn useful. Okay, so you get to choose one more phone to gain insight about, preferably choosing one that you've come across quite often, or you will do if you know what's coming. But yes, one more string to your bow on that one. And then Vanish. Now, the biggest criticism volleyed at against this ability is that it gives you a third of what a rogue gets at level 1, but as a level 14 ability. But this criticism avoids one key detail. So it's obviously comparing to the rogue's cunning action, which as a bonus action allows you to dash, disengage, or hide. Vanish allows you not only to hide as a bonus action, so yeah, it's only one of those three, but it also specifies that you can't be tracked by non-magical means unless you choose to leave a trail. Now, rogues don't get that distinction. That means that no matter how well they hide, creatures can still see their tracks and therefore are that much more likely to find a rogue that's been hiding compared to a ranger that's using Vanish that can't be tracked and therefore that much harder to find. Plus, if you're playing a ranger at this level, level 14, be sure to emphasize this detail to your DM about the not leaving a trail, as it's much more of an edge to your hide ability than any other class without this feature. You might say Vanish actually is a free version of Pass Without Trace that can be done with only a bonus action. Okay, it's only on yourself, but still, not leaving a trail, that's surely going to give you advantage on hiding checks, right? Now you no longer need to see an enemy to attack it. You no longer suffer the disadvantage on attack rolls against creatures you can't see, and you're aware of the location of any invisible creatures within 30 feet of you, provided it isn't hidden and you aren't blinded or deafened. So this ability, again, may be a little bit specialised, and of course there are other ways of seeing invisible creatures through magic items and so on. However, usually you will cast a spell because you suspect that there are invisible creatures in the area, which obviously costs you a spell slot, or else you'd be using your magical item. But with your inbuilt, essentially a lantern of revealing, you'll be able to identify invisible foes before anyone else gets even the slightest inkling that there are invisible creatures there. Generally, you're not going to waste a spell slot or pull out a magical item that helps you see invisible creatures unless you have some expectation of there being an invisible creature there. This ability can be used by your DM to essentially reveal to you before anyone else has even a whiff of it that there are invisible creatures present. So it's got that passive usefulness that may well be overlooked. So capstone abilities, they're often slated, and yeah, the ranger is no different to that, as your favoured enemy feature finally gets a combat upgrade. Once each turn, you add your wisdom modifier to the attack roll or damage roll you make against one of your favoured enemies. This argument often levelled is that spellcasters are literally warping reality by level 20, whilst the martial classes are somewhat left behind. As with other arguments touched on earlier in this video, this is not a fair comparison. In fact, the fairest comparison is with the other class level 20 abilities. Funny enough, most classes' capstone abilities can only be used once per short or long rest. The only exceptions to this are the monk, who, if they have no key points remaining when they roll initiative, regain 4 key points. The fighter, who gets their 3rd extra attack, allowing them to attack 4 times per round. And the druid, who can wild shape an unlimited number of times, probably the craziest of all the 20th level abilities, if we're being fair. The bard, who, if they're out of bardic inspiration when they roll initiative, regain 1 use. And the barbarian, who get a static increase of +4 to their strength and constitution scores. What? Okay. When you compare it with these, the ranger being able to add their wisdom modifier to 1 attack or damage roll against a favoured enemy each turn doesn't seem so underwhelming. Sure, it's not going to be used as much as the fighter's extra attack or the druid's wild shaping, if it's a circle of the moon druid anyway, or provide the general awesome power of the barbarian, but it still measures up with most classes. I wouldn't say it was any worse than getting 1 use of bardic inspiration back, or in fact getting 4 key points back, because you get to use this on multiple turns. You can use this again and again and again. It's once per turn, but sure, you can use it each turn if you're facing a favoured enemy. The other argument would be that actually as a capstone ability, really having this extra damage to your favoured enemies maybe should have been something that should have been given to you at early levels against your favoured enemies. But wouldn't that be overpowered? Okay, so the supposed fixes to the ranger that were introduced in Unearthed Arcana are often lauded as being the true ranger, and that this should be used. It's far superior to the PHB ranger. And to be honest, I think that this is overpowered. It's overcompensating. And that's, I think, one of the main reasons that hasn't been rolled out officially as a class, and it remains Unearthed Arcana. The supposed fixes to the ranger that were introduced, they were introduced not because the class itself is broken or nerfed, but because the ranger hasn't been utilised in the way that it was anticipated to. As I said when we were talking about favoured enemy and favoured terrain, Wizards of the Coast were expecting exploration to be a much more integral part of campaigns. But many games are played without it, thereby making the ranger at best a characterful, sometime contributor to the party, and at worst somewhat irrelevant. So combat has been made much more front and centre with the revised ranger, as an attempt to make the ranger more powerful to rival the fighter or the paladin, but this causes another problem: balance. It misses kind of the fundamental point that the ranger is meant to be good in a fight, but they're not meant to overtake the paladin or the fighter, because the fighter is all about fighting. The paladin is all about righteous smiting. Those are the kind of cornerstones of those character classes. The ranger is about ranging, roving, exploring. And so the revised ranger in the Unearthed Arcana kind of glosses over and basically assumes that you can do all of these things and do them amazingly well wherever you go, kind of taking away from the specialist aspect of the ranger. And yeah, I would personally, I think that if it's not broke, don't fix it, and the ranger most certainly is not broken. So, if you guys have any thoughts about the ranger, please leave them in the comments below. I look forward to reading them and replying to them. I should have said at the beginning that this is, of course, all just my opinion. None of this is necessarily set in stone, and I'm willing to listen to other people's opinions, and you, of course, can keep yours. If you disagree with me, that's totally fine. We can do this in an entirely reasonable way. But in defense of the ranger, don't believe the hype. If you want to play a ranger, play that ranger. Dungeons and Motherfucking Dragons!